Thank you. Today I'm just going to talk about off-site transport of nutrients and pesticides in the Mount Lofty Ranges. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge my collaborators Jim Cox and Nigel Fleming from SARDI, and Rai Kukana and Jenny Anderson from CSIRO. So, as most of you will be aware, the Mount Lofty Ranges is a major catchment for drinking water in South Australia. Historically, it's provided on average 60% of Adelaide's drinking water. Unlike some other catchments, particularly in the eastern seaboard that for drinking water supply, the Mount Lofty Ranges is heavily impacted, and about 90% of the land is privately owned, and there's a range of stakeholders and a range of uses of the water in this area. So what we've focused on in this study was looking at particularly horticulture and what impact different types of horticulture have had on the water quality. 3 sites were selected that were representative of the major horticultural activities in the area. They were an apple orchard and a cherry orchard and also a vineyard. And there's been quite a large increase in the area that's under vineyard production in the Mount Lofty Ranges, and there had been concern about what impact and a bit of finger pointing about the impact they were having on water quality. We specifically chose 3 sites that were hydrologically isolated, which had allowed us to be confident that what we were detecting in the runoff water could be attributed to those land uses. All 3 sites were instrumented with ISCO water samplers, and water was collected on a flow-weighted basis over a 3-year period. And also water level loggers were installed so that we were able to measure flow and then from that calculate the loads that were being transported. So this is the apple orchard. Let's hope I can get the pointer to work, yeah. So the apple orchard was a 64 hectare catchment. The direction of water is down that way, and the yellow dot here represents where we were sampling water. So water was being collected from this whole catchment. There was a culvert, so this is where the sampler was. There was a culvert under the road here, and that's where we were monitoring flow. We were quite fortunate in all these sites that the growers were quite willing to give us spray diaries. In Australia, for horticultural activities, growers are required for sale of produce that spray diaries are kept, and they were quite generous in their revelation of data about what was being applied. So this is the cherry orchard. It's a much smaller catchment. This is the area that was under cherries. Water moved that way, and again we were sampling at the end of that catchment. The water was then collected into a drain. At this site and also at the grapes, we had weirs installed with end constrictions, and that allowed us to monitor the flow. And then both of those were in the Cock Creek catchment, and this location was in the Charleston catchment, a much bigger area, flow moving that way. We had 2 sampling sites. One was sort of here, which is where that gum tree is there, just before it entered a dam, and then as it left, went over a spillway and into a creek. Now, as you can appreciate, there was a huge amount of data, so I'm only going to focus just on the relationships with flow. I'll briefly outline agricultural practices for those that aren't aware of the area. So for horticulture in this area, it's usually irrigated by drip or overhead irrigation. Some vineyards, particularly bush vines, may have no irrigation, but predominantly they will need to be irrigated. Pesticides, particularly insecticides and fungicides, are applied from around October to around December, January for cherries, and probably through till about March or April for the grapes and the apples. Again, the quantities that are applied depend very much upon the season and the pest pressure. So this is a demonstration of, you often hear the mantra that if you deal with contaminants in the first flush, your problems are solved. So deal with first flush and everything's problem solved there. So this is flow rate against the load, and this is an example for 2 chemicals. Prosimidone is a fungicide, Perimicarb is an insecticide. This is in cherries, and you can see a very good relationship here. So you get peak load with peak flow, and you get a declining load and hence declining concentration on the descending limb of the hydrograph. But unfortunately this general trend, which is what we were trying to see, whether there were general trends, didn't hold for everything. So this is an insecticide, chlorpyrifos. This is an example from 2 years with apples. It's a commonly used insecticide in apples and cherries. And as you can see here, there's no relationship whatsoever between the load and the flow. So it made it a bit difficult to sort of draw some generalisations with the data. So then if we look at total nitrogen, you can see in this example here with grapes, the same type of peak flow, peak load. So that worked quite well in that one event, but it wasn't a consistent result. It wasn't even a consistent result at the same site. Again with cherries, so just it's the same grapes here. We're getting peak load with peak flow, but we don't see a consistent trend. So then what we looked at is we looked at all of these events. So I'll just explain this. On this side is flow, which is all the bar charts coming down here, and this is load as a percentage of the total that moved off in that year. And there are the 3 years here. Pheneromol is, both of these, pheneromol and chlorpyrifos, are insecticides. The events in each year are not necessarily of the same duration, but they were that in that event, that was the flow volume and that was the load that moved off site. So in the first year, everything looked like it was going to follow a bit of a consistent trend. Irrespective of the flow, we got a peak first flush, we got a flush of pheneromol, a flush of chlorpyrifos, and it tended to drop off as the season went on. But unfortunately, this wasn't a consistent trend, and we found here, so in 2008, for example, we find that the load actually is going up. And here with chlorpyrifos, we found that when we got a peak flow, there was a peak load moved off site. So our generalisations weren't holding true. I'm going to show just the cherries data. So we've got data for cherries and for the grapes and for the apples, but because of time restrictions, I'm just showing generalisations. So this is for nitrogen. Again, the flow data for each event is at the top, and this is the total nitrogen, and this is phosphorus as grams per hectare that moved off site. And so you see here that there is a bit of a strong relationship for nitrogen. As we've got peak flow, we're getting peak loads moving off site, and again in that year. And we see it here for phosphorus as well, but it's not quite as consistent. So in summary, some of the other data that we looked at was in relation to environmental guidelines, and we did find that several of the insecticides and fungicides were exceeding environmental and in some cases drinking water guidelines. While the majority for the pesticides did move off in the first flush, one chemical in particular, chlorpyrifos, continued to move off for quite extended periods of time. And the other thing that we looked at was the phase that they moved off site, which is not reported here. With the nutrients, we found that the total phosphorus and total nitrogen moved off site through the whole season. While total phosphorus showed a strong relationship with flow, total nitrogen was more variable. So what does it matter and what does it mean? So I think knowing how chemicals move off site, knowing when they move off site and what moves off site from what land uses can inform monitoring, but it can also inform mitigation strategies and what mitigation strategies are going to be implemented. There is often some discussion about diverting that first flush and then you've dealt with your problem. But I think this data has shown that that doesn't necessarily hold. The other thing that I think it can inform is the diversion of water for ecological purposes and when it is best to divert water and from what land uses. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge it was 3 years work. There was a lot of people involved in the sampling and the analysis, and I'd like to acknowledge the financial support of the National Land Care program, ACR, and also the Centre for Natural Resource Management. Thank you. Spoke too quickly, didn't I?
We've got 5 minutes of question time, so has anyone got some questions? Yeah, Leon?
So what options are there for the soluble phase to prevent them from moving off-site?
Often things like sedimentation ponds aren't that effective, or even buffer strips, unless you can retard water and you have something that will degrade. So something like nitrate, it's not going to work for. So we're actually in the process of looking at low-cost sorbents and whether there's any possibility of using things like biochar or other forms of like chitosan as a sorbent material that won't necessarily leach anything, but may be useful as a sorbent within water streams. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
One pesticide that stands out as being more, I guess, mobile, is there anything in its properties in terms of water solubility or partitioning to organic carbon?
We did actually, which I haven't presented here, but we did actually look at a range of pesticide properties. So we looked at what phase they moved in. So we were looking at soluble and colloidally attached movement, and then plotted that against things like KOC values, which is their partitioning coefficients, water solubility, KOWs, and there was a bit of a trend for the lower solubility, but then it wasn't consistent. There were 2 compounds, I can give you the paper, there were 2 compounds that stood out that didn't fit the trend at all, and it wasn't really clear why. I shouldn't have spoke so quickly, shouldn't I?
You plotted the load of different contaminants, and load is flow times concentration. I wondered if you looked at plotting concentration versus flow and whether there's a relationship there.
We did do that, and again it was variable, and I don't have that data with me. So sometimes it did show a nice trend. That the problem we found that we didn't find consistent trends across every year. So the first year you'd think, oh, we're on a winner here, this is quite good, but then it would all fall apart in the second year. So, and it wasn't quite clear why. The growers weren't changing their practices. We were at the same sampling point. So it was a bit unclear why.
Okay, one more quick question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I had the same
Okay.
So, did you find any relation between fertilizer addition and the concentration in the program? So do you have observed or monitored that relation?
Between fertilizer?
Between fertilizer, because you are monitoring nitrates and phosphorus.
One thing that did stand out was that we had a very high load of nitrogen from the cherry grower, and he had applied chicken manure, and it was loaded with nitrogen. So that was quite mobile. So we could relate it to that. But when it came to other fertilisers, we didn't see a relationship.
Thanks, Danny.